to week 3. This week we're going to continue with the OWASP Top 10. The items that we're going to talk about this week are security misconfiguration and sensitive data exposure. So hopefully there's a lot of good lessons in there for you. We also have the Silver Bullet podcast. Lori Craner, who is at Carnegie Mellon, is going to talk about privacy and passwords. And Lori has also just recently come back from a time as Chief Technology Officer at the FTC. So she has lots of interesting things to say.
Okay, so our first breach of the week is a breach that occurred with the password management service LastPass. So LastPass is a system you can use to store all of the passwords you use for various different sites. You can use it to automatically generate secure passwords and then use a single LastPass password to log into all these sites while still maintaining the randomness of the individual sites. LastPass takes security very, very seriously for what they call their master password and their vault that stores all your passwords. So it was very interesting to see that they had a security issue with their web plugin. So essentially what a researcher at Google found, this guy's name is Travis Ormandy, so if you're paying attention in previous weeks, his name should sound familiar to you because he was also involved with the Cloudbleed exploit. He found that they were doing improper sandboxing of some of their scripts that were authenticating whether users who were they say they were. So when I say sandboxing, I mean that these scripts had access to functionality within the LastPass plugin that allowed users to, a malicious user to pass data to higher levels of the script they shouldn't have been allowed to. Ultimately, the chain of events that occurred is that Travis was able to trick the plugin into thinking that he was an authenticated user on LastPass.com itself, meaning that he could trick the site into giving up all of the individual passwords and all of the other things that could have been stored in the LastPass vault to someone who is maliciously manipulating the plugin.
Right, so but if you're a user of LastPass, right, you've already gotten an update. And they automatically updated, which is interesting. So this week is security misconfiguration, and so it's nice that they were actually able to make it mandatory. So if you, I'm assuming, open a new browser, you got a...
Yeah. It was, so before anyone else, before they disclosed how the vulnerability happened and that the vulnerability had even occurred, they had pushed the update, and in the interest in being good internet neighbors, they presented what the exploit was, why it happened, the pattern that caused it to happen in the first place, and explicitly called out in the blog that other companies that do the same sort of activities that LastPass does should look for that pattern in their own code base so that they could help the greater security community prevent this from ever occurring again, which is great. That's being a good neighbor. Right,
that definitely is. And also having a mechanism for a security update. Like the last thing you want in your company is like, oh no, we have a security update, what do we do now? So they fixed it, and then they had a mechanism for pushing the change out. So
it's always interesting to me when I hear stories like this and you hear about there's a lot of blowback against Windows right now for having automatic updates and causing people grief with those. And they get a lot of bad press for that, but then you look at situations like this, and I don't think anyone is really giving LastPass flack for fixing this automatically. So that's an interesting trade-off that isn't maybe not quite a logical response from the community at large.
Yeah.
In fact, LastPass was able to fix this in 24 hours, which is really incredible. They had all their developers working late into the night trying to get the push fixed. And they had already configured their extension so that it could automatically update itself in a very seamless process. But one important thing was that there were actually 2 versions of the extension. One that was just a regular extension, and then one that was like a binary compiled version. And that one actually had more vulnerabilities in it because it could actually cause the web browser to execute machine code, which is a much more dangerous threat. They uploaded the settings that you can check on your LastPass extension to see which version that you have, just to make sure that you actually have the updated version.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess another question is, like, do we recommend using these types of password managers like LastPass? And I guess we'd say we do, right?
Yeah, I'm actually a LastPass user, so I switched over to it after the Cloudbleed exploit that came out that we talked about a few weeks ago. It was kind of the impetus I needed to, take controlling my passwords a little bit more seriously.
So the other breach that we're going to talk about is the first time that we've been able to find a collision in a hash function called SHA-1. So SHA-1 is a cryptographic hash function, and these functions have a very important purpose in cryptography and encryption and file integrity. And essentially what a hash function does is it takes a large file or body of data and is able to compile it down into just a fixed width, in this case 160 bits of data that can uniquely identify or fingerprint this file. And the reason why these functions are so useful is because if you just modify the file a little bit, the cryptographic hash value will become completely different. And so this is a very useful way to tell that a file has been changed or modified.
Right.
Yeah, so hashing functions are often used for passwords because it doesn't matter that, so the hash is stored, it doesn't matter what the plain text is. It just, like if you type in your password, it'll run this algorithm and change it into the hash value. And we'll talk about this later in some of the modules. And so it doesn't, like, since it's a repeatable type of algorithm, every time you type your password in, it will have the same hash, and then you compare it to what's stored. And so if more than one things can come into this algorithm and have the same result, then that's a problem for the use of hashes.
Yeah, I think that this exploit really highlights the fact that you need to really keep up to date as a security professional. You can't just learn something when you were in school, declare victory, and go home and declare security finished. There's still documentation in several popular email clients like GNU-PG and that say, yeah, we use SHA-1 and it's perfectly secure and it's great. And maybe the documentation just hasn't been updated, but that was as soon ago as 2009. And organizations like Google and other important web companies have recommended that companies move away from SHA-1 for going on 6 or 7 years now. And if you don't keep up with that sort of information, you can think you're doing the right thing, but it turns out that you're wide open to attack.
Yeah.
But for the time being, Google had a huge array of computers to use to try to crack the hash function and create this vulnerability or artificially generate it. If an attacker actually wanted to try to do it, they would require 110 GPU years to be able to make this attack happen. So Google just had its huge, large infrastructure that enabled it to reveal this vulnerability.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, as these things go, it's only going to get better, not worse.
Yeah.
So as resources become more available and hackers have more resources available to them than ever before, and that's going to continue, I would definitely consider SHA-1 to be broken in terms of security at this point.
Yeah. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is Chris and I were at an NSA-sponsored conference this week. It's called Hot Sauce. It's HOT, SOS. SOS stands for Science of Security. And actually this year they added end privacy. So not to the name of the conference, but to the topics of the conference. So really, a theme about a lot of the talks this time over the 2 days was privacy. And just to give a shout out to NSA, they get a lot of flack for them intruding on our privacy. And I've worked with NSA closely for more than 10 years now, and I don't know under the covers. I'm not cleared. I'm an academic faculty member, but just based upon what I see, they really are striving to protect our national security and our privacy. And there can be trade-offs. But there was a variety of talks at the conference, keynotes, from a high level, user level, to lower level, something called differential privacy, which is a technical technique for injecting noise essentially into the data so that you can run analysis on the data without extracting any one particular person's data. And trying to show that one person's data is not going to change the answer. So do you have any thoughts about the conference too?
Yeah, so this is the third time I've attended Hot Sauce, and the shifts to privacy was really, really apparent. So 2 of the 3 keynotes were on privacy this time around, and I don't remember any of the keynotes being on the subject in previous iterations of the conference. The thing that I took away from it, besides the great differential privacy talk, was that everybody seemed to have a slightly different conception of what privacy was. And in several of the talks, they called out the fact that your customers are also going to have different conceptions of what privacy means. What they want you to do with your information is going to change based on the use of the data, based on society. It could change from month to month depending on what news articles come out about privacy. So it's another one of those things that it needs to be an active part of your business. It's not something that you can say, I've finished the privacy module for my widget creator. It's something that has to be considered throughout development and reevaluated, even if you haven't changed a single line of code.
Yeah.
Security is a topic that keeps on changing, and people have different views of security and what people want from it and what they expect companies to provide for them. It's always changing. So this is a topic that just can't be left once you think you've done a good job on it.
Yeah, one of the keynote speakers told a great story about 10 years ago, AOL wanted to help out the research community by providing search data for researchers to use and peruse to learn more about how search works. And they released what they thought was an anonymized data set. And some reporters from the New York Times came out and were able to go to someone's house whose data was in the thing and ask them what they thought about the fact that they were able to find them. And that ended up costing that person their job, the person who decided to release the data. That's where the differential privacy stuff really comes into play. And it's one of those things that I don't think that person whose house they went to really thought about whether they cared whether they were identified until the reporters showed up. So the fact that people's perspective on privacy can change is something that really needs to be considered if you're developing anything that controls customer data.
Yeah, and there's a naive view of privacy. So in naive views, like if we just take the names off, we're fine, or names and addresses off, we're fine. But it's very easy to re-identify people. They take one data set and another, put the two together, and then they have the identity back. So if you're in a domain where you are naively de-identifying the people in your database, it can probably be re-identified. So you need to really look at the literature and look at the algorithms that you really should be using. The other hard thing about privacy is that there's such difference. Like the three of us have different privacy preferences. So if you're building an application, who do you pick as the person that you're developing for? And what makes it even harder is that if you asked each one of us what our privacy preferences are, we'd tell you, but then we might go and act completely differently. Yeah. So we'll tell you our privacy, preferences for Facebook until we are behind closed doors and we'll do whatever we want. And so it's really, really hard to get privacy requirements out. So, I wish we had some answers for you, but that's a very active research area.
The default that one of the keynote speakers talked about in his talk was the fact that, the EU actually drives a lot of what companies end up doing in terms of privacy right now, because they have the most restrictive privacy laws in the world right now. So it makes sense, if you don't want to get sued by somebody, to do whatever the most stringent thing is. And that's kind of become the default action of a lot of these companies, which makes a certain amount of sense.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks. Have a good week.